All right, joining us now, former CIA Director John Brennan. He's a senior national security and intelligence analyst for NBC News. Former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, retired four-star Navy Admiral James Stavridis. He is Chief International Security and Diplomacy Analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. Also with us, President of the Council on Foreign Relations and author of the book, A World in Disarray, Richard Haass. Richard testified yesterday before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in a hearing to assess the value of the NATO alliance. We'll talk about that in just a moment.
Mr. Director, let me begin with you. All that is old is new again. I mean, if you talk to George W. Bush, he'd say, man, they were leaking about me at the CIA around the clock. Barack Obama would say the same thing. The State Department's always leaked. This does happen, but perhaps not in such a dramatic manner. Is this a new chapter, or have we seen it before?
Well, I might take issue with your premise. I don't think George W. Bush and Barack Obama said that it was leaking around the clock. They were concerned about it, but the New York Times editorial, to me, is not a leak. It is an expression of deep concern and worry. It's certainly reflective of what a lot of people have been saying over the past year, that Donald Trump has not fulfilled his responsibilities. So I think there are a lot of people within the government who are quite frustrated with the situation and are now taking extreme measures to try to reassure the American people that there are people within the administration who are trying to counter what Donald Trump is doing.
Admiral, there have been reports that military leaders have been ignoring some of the president's more outrageous orders. And while I celebrate that in 2017, 2018, that we didn't make an effort to assassinate a foreign leader. We have a cherished tradition of civilians controlling the military. What dangerous precedents may be set here?
Yeah, very dangerous. At the end of the day, what you see is just dysfunctionality in a chain of command. And that, I think, ought to worry all of us. Regardless of who sits atop that chain of command, you want a functioning executive branch. You must have a functioning military.
Admiral, could I ask you a pointed question?
Sure.
If you were in a position where somebody gave you the order to assassinate a foreign leader, to do something that you believed was illegal or was dangerous, would you ignore that order? Would you confront the person in the chain of command? Or would you retire and tell the world about it?
I'd take door number 3. And I think at the end of the day, there's a spectrum of what the order is. But assassinating somebody, killing their family, deliberate collateral damage, those kinds of things, I think, scream for not only will I not do it, and not only will I confront, but you have an obligation, I think, as a senior leader to step up and make that public.
And not simply ignore the order.
That would be my view.
Wouldn't that be the view of most of the men and women you served with in the Navy?
I think so. And again, there's a spectrum here. But at the end of the day, I think any leader in any position has the responsibility to illuminate a situation when things are going off the rails. And I would argue doing so in a public way does great service to the country.
I think it's much more complicated. That to me is not the hard case. Imagine tomorrow President Trump called his senior people and said, and gave them the order to attack North Korea. He could say that Kim has violated his commitments he made at the summit, and he believes a preventive military strike. Now, that might be you may think it's a really bad idea. It's not illegal. It's within the spectrum of foreign policy possibilities.
Exactly.
That seems to me a not unrealistic scenario that we could be facing, where he wants to do something big, consequential, that you may think is dangerous, you may think is misguided, you may think is bad for the interests of the United States. It's not illegal, though, and it's not off the foreign policy spectrum. We could face something like that.
And what are you suggesting, that admirals and generals make decisions unilaterally on what they think, what orders they should follow and what orders they shouldn't follow?
I don't think you can run a government. That's insubordination.
It's not America.
But I think there's ways you push back.
Isn't that what's happening right now, insubordination up and down the chain of command?
It is. And people are basically, who would never applaud it, are saying this is such an extraordinary moment, we're willing to live with it. But what you've been talking about is exactly right. It's a dangerous precedent. and it's not something that's sustainable. Also, unlike Nixon, when people would do things against Nixon, he didn't know about it. We found out about it later that Schlesinger was doing this or that. Here, this is happening in real time. We now have a feedback loop where this president knows that people around him are actively subverting his orders. This is not a sustainable situation.
Which really suggests that the op-ed really is doing a service to no one except the person who wrote the op-ed, so they can write a book or an article for The Atlantic or somebody else later on how I won the war.
And likely only heightens all the characteristics described about the president in this book and makes him more isolated and paranoid about what's happening. Director Brennan, given this conversation right here, let me ask you the question I posed at the beginning of the show, which is, does this anonymous op-ed put together with the Woodward book make you feel better or worse about the state of the White House, about the state of the country? In other words, are you terrified that we have a president like this sitting in the Oval Office, or are you somehow reassured that there are enough people around him performing an act of being guardrails effectively?
Well, I had suspected that things were going to get worse before they get better. And indeed, we're now in the worsening point, where someone, senior administration official, according to the New York Times, took this extraordinary step. And I do have great concerns about the insubordination, but also I have concerns that Donald Trump continues to be in the Oval Office and to sit atop of an administration that, first of all, is not following some of his orders, but also his recklessness, irresponsibilities, his amorality. I mean, we're in extraordinary times. So I think the McCain funeral that really underscored to the nation the importance of the American values that are not being followed by Donald Trump, the Woodward book, and now this. I think there's a cumulative effect that may, in fact, reach a tipping point. What that tipping point is, I don't know, but it should be a wake-up call to a lot of people within the administration, within the Congress, that, as Richard said, this is not a sustainable situation, especially for a country like the United States that has such global responsibilities.
Yeah, and that's where I would take it is, how does this look in Moscow? How does this look in Beijing? This looks really good. And how does this look in Brussels for the NATO alliance? This is a disaster. And it's just that, exactly as John says, this is that cumulative effect that is poisoning our domestic well, but it's seeping into the ground springs of the international system. That's what ought to concern us.
Even Robert Mueller is concerned about the impact of having Donald Trump's testimony before him go public, because it would so damage the United States' reputation across the globe. Mika, I remember about 6 months ago, you said it privately first, very concerned, and then you talked about it on the show. I think you're very concerned about Trump's excesses, but also the excesses in response to Trump, either from the intel community or the military community or from the media, that the overreach that would come in response to Donald Trump's aberrant behavior would actually create a greater crisis. Is this an example of that?
I think so, and I think it's far more dangerous than it might feel right now, because I think, as you said, Director Brennan, the worst is coming. And the Admiral pointed out that door 3 would be the option: quit, speak out, as a service to America. Nobody's choosing door 3.
Nobody.
And I think while you think you're doing the right thing, what you're actually doing is helping President Trump do what Madeleine Albright thinks he's doing, which is breaking down the presidency and creating something far different that we've seen in other countries and that we don't want here in the United States of America. Mike Barnacle is with us, and he has a question. Mike.
Well, these past few minutes of this discussion have been, again, stunning to me. We're talking about the presidency, and we're talking about a sitting president who has been described as amoral, petty, ineffective. And John Brennan, it would seem now that we're at a point where public servants, you were at the CIA for years, you were at the NSA for years, where conscience might take precedence over the oath of office that you take and others take when you're surrounded by a president who just might take the country right off the rails.
Right.
Well, it's against the law to follow an order that you know is illegal. And so I think there's an obligation on the part of all administration officials to resist something like that. But an order that's given, as Richard said, that may have a disastrous future to it in terms of impacting the United States, I think it does require individuals of conscience to be able to push back against such an order and to try to resist it. And I think we have seen examples of Jim Mattis and others doing exactly that. But then if you feel that you cannot make headway against Donald Trump in terms of turning him around, I think there's an obligation to go to Congress. And this is why it's so important for the Congress, Republicans and Democrats alike, to put the interests of the country above the interests of themselves and the party. Because the Congress is supposed to be a check on the chief executive. And if the chief executive is going to be giving orders that are going to lead us down a disastrous path, we need to get the Congress involved, and we need to be able to stop such actions.
You know, Willie, James Fellows, yes, I mean, he's in this case, he's been the hedgehog, just nonstop. It only takes two Republicans. It only takes two Republicans. It only takes one Republican. Now, it only takes one Republican. And James Fellows repeatedly says to all of these Republican senators, said, we'll go on the floor and deliver these eloquent speeches about constitutional norms being trashed, or Donald Trump's aberrant baby. It only takes one of you to say, I'm going to bring this to an end right now. I'm going to caucus with the Democrats, or I'm going to vote against the president's legislation until he puts something in place that assures A, B, C, that constitutional norms are followed, that the rule of law is respected, that our foreign policy is handled in a responsible way. Not one Republican will stand up and do that. Not one Republican.
Well, we've heard some Republicans speak out. Most of them are leaving town in 2 months. They're about to, you know, their Senate careers are over. The proposal was put out to protect Bob Mueller through legislation. That was shot down by the majority leader. There's no appetite for that kind of thing in the Senate. And John Meacham, to me, the extraordinary thing, as you pointed out earlier, is that we are 20 months into the administration, and we're seeing this kind of meltdown around the president within his White House in the Woodward book, and now from a senior administration official, we don't know who or from what part of the government. This is not some book written 5 years or 10 years after. This is happening in real time, a year and a half into the first term of this presidency.
It's as though we have a kind of virtual webcam inside the Oval Office. You know, if the final days had played out as reality TV. And so we don't have the perspective. And I think the good news about this is we have the information. Registered voters have this information as they head into November and then as we head into 2020. A quick question for Director Brennan. Sir, you were in the business for a long time of preparing psychological profiles of foreign leaders. If you were preparing, you can see where this is going.
Okay.
If you were briefing an American president on this American president, what would be the top line of your psychological profile?
That, as we anticipated, this individual is going to be facing increasing pressure from within, and that the walls are collapsing around, and his mercurial and reckless nature might lead him to do something rash, to distract attention from his problems, his domestic problems. We've seen this behavior before in terms of authoritarian leaders who will try to continue to suppress and repress any type of opposition and try to remove any threats that he or she sees that are rising on the political scene. But I wouldn't rule out that there's going to be some type of effort to engage in some type of action that will distract attention from his political problems.
It's a lot better when he says it.
You're just waiting for the next inject in the Hunger Games. And
Oh my God!
It's not just to distract. I think what's also missing is Donald Trump has now been publicly challenged about his ability to execute his office. That's what this op-ed is. We're basically saying we are undermining your presidency from within. The question will be now whether he can resist the temptation, or what he might even see as the need, to reassert presidential authority against people from within who are working against him. That is why this op-ed is dangerous. It puts the public pressure on this president to respond, to say, if you'll almost to say, Al Haig, I am in charge here.
Yeah.
And that's what the president will feel compelled
And the
to do.
people around him have got to ask themselves, when do I stop being a guardrail and become an enabler?
That's right.
That's the gut question for a lot of people in the White House this morning.
And a wounded lion is very dangerous, and he is very wounded.
And what Donald Trump still doesn't understand is that presidents aren't dictators.
No.
I remember when he, during the campaign, would say, I'm going to make Paul Ryan's life very difficult. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. And we would laugh and say, you do understand that Paul Ryan has a checkbook. Saying that judges don't have the legitimate authority to question his presidential orders. So-called judges. He does not understand that when he starts firing James Mattis, and when he starts firing Jeff Sessions, and when he starts firing anybody that he can fire in retribution to this article and to the Woodward book, that the Senate is not going to confirm an attorney general or a SecDef to his liking. And this, at the end of the day, Director Brennan, it's the ignorance. It is the ignorance of not only the office he holds, but of Madisonian government. He had no idea what he was stepping into, and from everybody that's been close to him that has tried to help him along, to explain to him how the United States federal government works, how Madisonian checks and balances work, it's just completely disinterested.
It's ignorance, it's arrogance, it's recklessness, it's impulsivity. It's all those things combined in one. And that's why I think we are at a very, very dangerous point right now in our history. And how this plays out in the coming days, weeks, and months, I think is going to determine just how much harm is done to this country before we get back on the right course.
Former CIA Director John Brennan, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr.
Stay
Director.
with us. Still ahead, Richard Haass was testifying about the importance of NATO.
Did you say while he was?
At the same time.
Did you shoot out the audience? They were all asleep.
Oh, stop
all
it. Yeah,
fell
that's not
asleep.
true.
Richard.
I was watching with bated
Joe.
breath on C-SPAN.
You don't
It was
think people
amazing.
were watching the Supreme Court hearing or the technology
I
people?
had 2 monitors going.
They were thinking
Stop it.
pensively, actually, and then you started
It
talking
was
about
subtle.
the Yankees.
Okay, so while he was doing that,
The Ocho, C-SPAN.
talking about the importance of NATO, President Trump was questioning the cost in an interview with the Daily Caller. We'll get to that next on Morning Joe.
I see you all the time on the Ocho, man. Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.